Hello, I'm Gunther.
And I am Tinka.
And we are
the Hessen Heifers.
Just kidding, it's Sammie.
And Elle.
And we're here to tell you about women's reproductive rights. Elle, take it away.
Here we go. For centuries, women have been considered inferior to men. Politically, socially, and economically, women have never been treated equally, specifically with reproductive rights. The government has gotten involved with women's reproductive rights in both positive and negative ways. As the White House has seen different administrations, women's rights have seen both progress and hindrance. Throughout the whole 17th and 18th century, birth control and abortion were unaccepted in American culture. Women had little to no control over their bodies. Abortions did not become commonplace until the late 20th century, yet they've been happening much longer. The first known abortion took place in 1550 BCE in ancient Egypt through medicinal induction. Since then, women have performed abortions through various procedures. Since the late 1800s, when the coat hanger was invented, people have used them to avoid pregnancy. This practice, though less common, still exists today, especially in places where Planned Parenthood and other reproductive clinics are not available. Some other dangerous methods women have used to abort a pregnancy are piercing the fetus with a knitting needle, belly flopping onto a hard surface, consuming dried henna powder to injure their livers, attempting to suck the fetus out with a catheter, and douching with Clorox bleach to cause intense chemical burns. These methods were really risky and often become fatal to women who attempted them. That's why Planned Parenthood is an essential organization for women in need of abortions as well as other services. Planned Parenthood offers STD testing and treatment, cancer screenings, and contraceptives along with abortions. Despite Planned Parenthood's various contributions, the government rarely supports them. Until recently, the government has almost always opposed Planned Parenthoods and any form of abortion or birth control.
Even today, where birth control and abortion are much more common, the government has been taking anti-abortion stances. The Trump administration specifically has begun to undo years of progress for women. On April 6, 2017, President Trump signed legislation aimed at cutting off federal funding to Planned Parenthood and any other organization performing abortions. Basically, through this legislation, anti-abortion taxpayers can ensure that their dollars won't fund abortions. However, abortions only make up 3% of Planned Parenthood's total services. Most of what Planned Parenthood does is already non-abortion related, and the Hyde Amendment of 1976 prevents tax dollars going towards abortion specifically. So, by defunding Planned Parenthood, what's really happening is that patients who rely on Planned Parenthood as a public health care program are being blocked. Planned Parenthood passionately opposes this, stating that decisions about reproductive health care are personal, and that one should fight to keep them that way, in a popular campaign. Trump's legislation defunding Planned Parenthood was highly controversial, and the vote in Congress was so close that it came down to Vice President Mike Pence casting the tie-breaking vote in Senate, announcing that life was winning again in America. Pro-life supporters' goal of defunding Planned Parenthood is to express their opposition to an organization that provides abortions, whether it's paid for by the government or not. However, this is illogical because 97% of the services are absolutely unaffiliated with abortion, because the Hyde Amendment outlaws it. The Hyde Amendment was created in 1976 to prohibit federal funding of any sort going towards abortions. The amendment initially said, "None of the funds in any trust fund, to which funds are appropriated in this Act, shall be expended for any abortion." Since 1976, a few exceptions have been made, where the government will fund abortions in the case of rape, incest, and when the mother's life is at stake. However, for any other instance in which a mother seeks an abortion but cannot afford one, this law is very restrictive. Abortion was legalized in 1973 through court ruling Roe v. Wade, in which a state law that forbid abortions, except to save the mother, was declared unconstitutional. In the 3-year span between Roe v. Wade and the Hyde Amendment, from 1973 to 1976, there were 300,000 abortions each year that used federal tax dollars. This equated to 25% of all abortions. After the Hyde Amendment, 1 in 4 women were unable to receive abortions unless their situation complied with 3 narrow scenarios. Henry J. Hyde, the creator of the Hyde Amendment, stated, "I certainly would like to prevent, if I could legally, anybody having an abortion, a rich woman, a middle-class woman, or a poor woman. Unfortunately, the only vehicle available
is the Medicaid bill. Nearly 17 million women within reproductive age rely on Medicaid as their primary source of health care. Medicaid is a jointly funded federal-state health insurance program for low-income people. The program paid for abortions prior to the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment has been enforced to block Medicaid funding for abortion services. As a result, the Hyde Amendment is particularly harmful to low-income women, women of color, young people, and immigrants, many of whom rely on Medicaid as their main health care coverage. In 1984, nearly 60% of women on Medicaid paid for abortions with pocket money saved for food, rent, and other living expenses. Not only has the federal government imposed on women's reproductive rights, individual state governments have taken abortion funding into their control too. One state, South Dakota, completely disregards the Hyde Amendment and only provides abortion coverage in life or death situations. By implementing the Hyde Amendment, the government prevented thousands of women from access to abortion, infringing on their right of choice.
Moreover, the government has taken opposing stances towards birth control for centuries. Back in 1873, President Grant passed the Comstock Act, which criminalized the distribution of both devices and simply information related to contraceptives and abortion. It stated that no obscene book, pamphlet, picture, paper, print, or other publication of an indecent character or thing designed or intended for the prevention of contraception or procuring abortion be distributed. Anthony Comstock became appalled by the immoral living of those around him and worked with the Young Men's Christian Association, also known as the YMCA, to lobby for the Comstock Act. In his crusade, he destroyed more than 160 tons of literature and pictures that he considered obscene. This was an early violation of rights and was actually tried in court for obstructing the First Amendment multiple times in the later 1900s. Furthermore, the government breached women's reproductive rights here immensely. The government not only restricted women's opportunity to protect themselves from unwanted pregnancies and STDs, they rescinded their right to even discuss and inform themselves on the matter. The Comstock Act was later repealed by the court case Griswold v. Connecticut, which stated that banning the use of contraceptives was a violation of marital privacy. However, this ruling happened in 1965, meaning there was about a 90-year period where contraceptives were completely outlawed.
On a completely opposite note, throughout the Progressive era, the government implemented federally funded forced sterilization programs. Instead of preventing abortions as the government has often tried to do in the past, the government attempted to limit population growth of who they saw as undesirable. These undesirable populations include immigrants, people of color, poor people, unmarried mothers, and the disabled. One of the first victims in the United States was Carrie Buck. In 1924, the 17-year-old was sterilized unknowingly after giving birth to her first child, who was a product of being raped by a foster parent. The government believed both Carrie and her mother were feeble-minded and promiscuous, so her children were destined to become imbeciles. The government's interest in coercing women into sterilization rooted in a wave of progressive-era public health activism that many believed would rid the United States of hereditary problems. Eugenic scientists claimed that the aim of eugenics was to represent each class or sect by its best specimens, then to leave them to work out their common civilization in their own way. Sterilization was not a punishment, according to the government, but an efficient method of protecting the health of individuals and the American people as a whole. Yet again, this demonstrates another example of the government's intervention with women's reproductive rights.
Over time, women have almost always been considered inferior to men, and this has been reflected in how the government has intervened in women's reproductive rights. The government has not hesitated to restrict women's reproductive rights as they have seen fit in numerous cases. In 1876, the government passed the Comstock Act with little to no controversy in order to contain the spread of allegedly immoral practices of contraceptives and abortion. Not only did they illegalize the act of abortion and birth control devices, they outlawed the mere spread of information regarding them. Then, in the 1920s, the government coerced women into sterilization so that they could bar people with unfavorable traits from passing them down hereditarily. The government completely overstepped by handpicking which people exactly they would perform sterilization procedures on without the victim's knowledge or consent. Later, in 1963, the government passed the Hyde Amendment. This amendment kept any federal money from funding abortions except in cases of rape, incest, and to save a mother's life. Now, Trump is trying to reduce the funding even more to exclude any organization that provides abortion, mainly targeting Planned Parenthood. In reference to Planned Parenthood, Trump says that they have millions of women going through Planned Parenthood that are helped greatly, but I wouldn't fund it. I would defund it because of the abortion factor, which they say is 3%. I don't know what percentage it is. They say it's 3, but I would defund it because I'm pro-life. But millions of women are helped by Planned Parenthood. Trump himself admits that Planned Parenthood helps so many women, but he still chooses to defund them because of the one aspect he disagrees with. Politicians so commonly interfere with people's lives on the basis of their own personal beliefs. As depicted in this political cartoon, women are unable to receive birth control in places where their local government disagrees with it. The Hyde Amendment is a victim of Trump and other politicians' political agendas. That and Trump's current legislation to strip Planned Parenthood of its funding are aimed to eliminate the practice of abortion in the U.S., but also to free taxpayers from paying for abortions when they strongly disagree with it. However, taxpayers frequently have to pay for things that they don't always agree with. For example, people who are morally opposed to war on religious grounds still have to pay taxes that fund the military programs. So just because some people are personally opposed to abortion doesn't mean they should be exempt from paying taxes that go towards abortion facilities. Until recent years, the government has strictly been under male control, and so often throughout history, the government has involved itself in women's reproductive rights in ways that do not favor most women. Though we have made progress as a country, and some politicians have been essential to the gains that have been made, the government as a whole has hindered women's reproductive progress more than it's helped.